Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the next in this series of talks about how we can be change makers that bridge divides rather than deepening them, in the process becoming a larger us rather than a them and us. Now, this is the first of a series of talks within that, looking at key capacities that we need to build as change makers that can help us to build a larger us rather than a them and us. We're going to be looking this time around at defusing. That's in particular changing how we and our audiences respond to things that we perceive as threats. Next week, we're going to be looking at belonging, how we can build belonging as a central element of our change-making practice and some of the benefits that that can bring. After that, we're going to be looking at bridging. This is really about how we bridge political divides and communicate with people who may have very different values or perspectives to our own. And then finally, we're going to be looking at navigating, how we can help the audiences and the communities that we work with to navigate this period of crisis and uncertainty and shocks. And in each of those four areas, we're going to be looking at three levels. The I level, which is really about the kind of inner work that we ourselves need to do in our own lives. The we level, which is all about our relationships, whether those are with our family and our friends or with our team and our organization. And then finally, the world level. This is the level of kind of change making, of trying to change the state of the world. So let's look at the first of those four areas, defusing. Now, what we're really talking about here is the fight, flight, freeze threat response, something that's hardwired into us. When we go into fight, flight, freeze, part of our brain called the amygdala, right down at the bottom of our brain, automatically fires up our sympathetic nervous system and activates the fight, flight, freeze response. Now, of course, you know how that feels in the body. Our hearts speed up. You can feel adrenaline flowing into the bloodstream. Our muscles start to tense. We're literally getting ready to fight or flee for our lives. Now, when we're faced with physical danger, fight, flight, freeze is a really effective response. It's a big part of the reason why all of us as individuals are alive today, but also why we as a species are still around. It's really effective faced with physical danger. But something that's really important for us as change makers is that fight, flight, freeze doesn't just get fired up by physical danger. It can also get fired up by social or political things that we perceive as threatening, like when we watch the news or when we're doom scrolling on our phones or when we meet people whose views seem totally different to our own. When that happens, what's especially important is that as well as firing up all those physiological changes that I mentioned just a moment ago, fight, flight, freeze also has all sorts of emotional effects on how we're feeling as well. For one thing, when we're in fight, flight, freeze, we quickly feel overwhelmed, like it's all kind of too much to take in or to cope with. In that state, we become less empathetic, less attuned to how other people may be feeling. And we often get much more aggressive instead, the kind of fight part of the equation. We're focused in fight, flight, freeze very much on our individual self-interest, on our own kind of safety and well-being. We're not really thinking about the common good in this state. And relatedly, we really lock into our in-groups when we're in fight, flight, freeze. We get kind of more tribal. Think of what happens when you see two groups of football fans squaring off against each other. And then finally, when we're in fight, flight, freeze, we're much less good at critical or imaginative or reflective thinking. We're less good at telling the difference between what's real on one hand and what's merely hypothetical or illusory on the other. So it makes us more vulnerable to things like conspiracy theories. Now, all of those are great reasons why authoritarian or populist political leaders will often deliberately try to keep their audiences in a fight, flight, freeze state. Think, for example, of what happens at one of Donald Trump's MAGA rallies, where he's deliberately keeping his audience on edge, fired up by emotions of threat or disgust or contempt, because that creates very fertile soil for these kinds of politicians to operate from. But they're not the only ones that often take their audiences into a fight, flight, freeze state, because we as change makers may do it as well, sometimes deliberately or sometimes unintentionally. I think, for example, of lots of environmental campaigns which lead on the idea that maybe we only have a few years left to save the climate, I've seen campaigns that argue that we only have 60 harvests left before the earth is exhausted for good. I even know of one environmental activist who, while giving a talk to a room full of school children, told them that it was unlikely most of them would live to middle age because of climate change. Now, these are all examples of how we can take people into that fight, flight, freeze state as a way of firing them up with the justice or the urgency of the causes that we work on. We often do it as well on social media. Think of what makes tweets go viral on Twitter. If you're leading with outrage or disgust or contempt or a sense of threat, again, it's a very effective way of generating retweets, likes, and followers. Or think as well of the images that we often use in our campaigns. Think, for example, of how international development NGOs may lead with very traumatic images of children suffering during famines. Now, in all of these cases, we may think there are good reasons for using fight, flight, freeze. It is an effective way of firing people up. And we're not saying it's never the right thing to do, but we are saying that it's worth being mindful about some of the costs that can be associated with taking our audiences into that kind of mental state, and indeed of taking ourselves into that mental state. One of those costs is the risk of burnout, something that's completely endemic in the change-making sector. We may have felt it ourselves or know other people who've had to take time off work or have just felt completely frazzled because we feel the weight of the world on our shoulders, we feel the clock ticking, and we just get burned out by the issues that we work on. But it's not just us. It can also happen with the people that we're trying to communicate with our supporters or our communities. Because again, when we're constantly leading with a sense of emergency, of overwhelm, of crisis, it can create the particular kind of burnout that we call compassion fatigue, where people just feel exhausted by all of the kind of images and stories of emergency and need that are flying at them. And they just start to shut down internally. Not the kind of mental and emotional state that we want to get people into if we're wanting them to kind of feel empathetic towards others. And then there's also the particular danger that political scientists call mutual radicalization. And this is what happens where you have two sides and one side starts to act out in ways that feel threatening to the other side. Maybe they're displaying contempt or disgust towards them, for example, on social media, for instance. And then the second side, because it can feel that contempt coming its way and perceives a sense of threat, starts acting out in ways that make the first side feel threatened, who then have their threat response amped up even more. And you can see how the stage is set for a kind of ping pong dynamic where there's no real change happening here, no real kind of breakthrough or transformation, other than a net increase in the level of toxicity in political debate. And a good example of what this can look like is what happened in the 2016 US presidential election, when Hillary Clinton made her infamous comment about half of Donald Trump's supporters being a basket of deplorables. Of course, what Hillary Clinton thought she was trying to do was just fire up her political base, in this case, a room full of funders, to get them to part with dollars for her campaign. But what actually happened was that she activated the sense of threat response among Donald Trump's supporters, who then became much more fired up and started acting out in ways that made Democrats feel more threatened. Hillary Trump regarded that as a catastrophic mistake in her campaign, but it was one way in which the kind of overall temperature of fight, flight, freeze was raised with no real transformation, just more political toxicity. So that's a quick snapshot of fight, flight, freeze, how it's great at keeping us safe from physical danger, but can also be fired up by social or political things with all kinds of emotional impacts. That can be something that we decide is worth doing as part of our change making, but it also comes with potential costs like burnout, compassion fatigue, and mutual radicalization. And in the next talk, we'll look at some of the alternatives to using fight, flight, freeze.